You think you're seeing the world as it is, raw, neutral, objective. But what if you're not seeing the world? You're seeing your version of it, a version quietly shaped by years of experiences, impressions, and invisible wounds. You walk into a room and someone glances at you for just a moment too long. You freeze. That single glance becomes a sentence, a narrative, a confirmation. They don't like me. I said something wrong. I don't belong here. But did they really think that? Or did your mind simply reach for the most familiar explanation? And it's rehearsed countless times before. That's the thing about perception. We mistake it for reality. But perception is a lens. And the lens is never clean. It's fogged with memory colored by fear, curved by longing. You don't see what's there. You see what you expect, what you fear, what you hope, what you've already decided is true. And once you decide, everything else bends to fit the shape of that belief. This is the quiet power of confirmation bias, a tendency wired into every human mind, where we seek out and give weight to information that supports what we already think and unconsciously filter out what challenges it. You may think you're open-minded, but the mind resists contradiction like a wound resists salt. Even when truth knocks gently, your psyche may not open the door, not because you're stubborn, but because you're scared. Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The same applies to thought. Until you make the bias visible, you will call it truth. Imagine your thoughts like a flashlight in a pitch-dark cave. But here's the catch. This flashlight only points where you already believe the path is. It refuses to turn in directions you deem wrong, unlikely, or too painful. You keep walking in circles, convinced you're discovering new things. But you're retracing the same thought paths over and over. You think you're gathering evidence, but often you're gathering echoes. You look for signs that people are judging you, and you find them. You seek out proof that you're not enough, and you uncover memory after memory, all conveniently supporting that story. You avoid reminders of your worth because they feel too foreign to trust. Your mind isn't trying to lie to you. It's trying to protect you. It's using its filter to guard the ego you've constructed, even if that ego is exhausted, even if it's built on old pain. That's the paradox. Your biases aren't born from arrogance. They're born from fear of being wrong, fear of changing the story, fear of seeing clearly because clarity might undo everything that has kept you emotionally alive until now. Alfred Adler would say that every distortion in perception serves a goal, a hidden purpose. Maybe your bias toward seeing the world as unsafe isn't irrational. Maybe it helps you stay hyper-aware, guarded, prepared. Maybe your belief that you're not lovable isn't a fact but a strategy. A way to keep expectations low, to avoid hurt, to make rejection less surprising. In that sense, your biases are psychological survival tools. Adaptive in the short term, corrosive over time. They are armor forged from logic twisted just enough to feel solid, but light enough to wear every day. And the more they protect you, the more invisible they become. You stop questioning the filter. You start believing it's the glass of the world itself. But here's a soft question. What if that filter is smudged? What if it's cracked in places coloring every interaction with a past that no longer fits the present? What if you're not seeing others as they are, but as your younger self once needed them to be? What if every difficult moment now is being interpreted through the eyes of a child who just wanted to feel safe or loved or seen? Then the judgment you feel from others may not be real. It may be your own shame bouncing off the mirror of their gaze. The rejection you sense may not be happening. It may be your old story whispering warnings just loud enough to drown out the present. This is the identity trap. When you become so used to a certain narrative, I'm not enough. People are dangerous. I always mess things up, that your mind works overtime to keep that identity intact, even if it's painful, even if it's false, because changing it would require mourning who you thought you were. And change, at its core, is grief. Not a failure, but a familiarity. You cling to what you've always believed, not because it's helpful, but because it's yours. Now pull back. Imagine standing on a shore, staring at the sea. But the sea is not water. It's a fog, thick and silver, endless. You shine a lantern into the mist, but it only lights a small patch, and that patch is all you trust. You never wonder what lies outside it. You assume that what you can see must be all there is. But the sea stretches on silent and unmapped. That's your mind. That's bias. That's the illusion of clarity. The brain doesn't seek truth. It seeks coherence, and coherence feels like safety. But sometimes safety becomes a cage. Sometimes the thoughts that feel the most right are simply the ones you've rehearsed the longest. So ask yourself, when you're certain about something, are you certain because it's true or because it fits your story? Are you sure you're right? Or are you just afraid of being wrong? There's no need to tear down your beliefs. No need to rip the filter away. Just notice it, gently, with curiosity instead of judgment. Because once you become aware of the lens, it softens. You start to see where you've been looking there and where you've never dared to. Maybe the world isn't how you thought it was. Maybe it's wider, softer, stranger. Maybe you're not wrong, just incomplete. And that's not failure. That's the beginning of seeing not through the fog, but with it. Let it swirl, let it distort, and still let yourself walk forward, eyes open, filter known, no longer trapped inside the image, but moving beyond it, toward something truer than certainty presence. You often believe the stories in your mind because they feel true, but true and familiar are not the same thing. That's the trick your brain plays. It confuses emotional weight with factual accuracy. You remember a moment from childhood, a time when someone ignored you, didn't call back, dismissed what you said. And even now, years later, you feel the echo of that pain. You tell yourself, see, that's the proof. I've always been invisible. I've always been too much. But was that memory always shaped this way? Or has your mind quietly rewritten it over time to match the narrative you've grown used to? The more often a thought repeats, the more real it feels. Not because it's been verified, but because it's been rehearsed. Over and over, like a looped recording you can't switch off. This is the availability heuristic, a cognitive bias that convinces you that the things you recall easily must be the most important, the most accurate, the most real. You don't even realize it's happening. You just reach for a conclusion and it's right there, ready, vivid, emotionally charged. And because it feels immediate, you believe it must be correct. But think of your mind like a library with faulty lighting. Some books sit in the spotlight, open, glowing, easy to reach. Others fade into the shadows, not because they're irrelevant, but because they don't fit your current mood, your current fear, your current self. So you return again and again to the same stories, the ones about failure, rejection, loneliness, because they are illuminated. And then you think, if I keep remembering this, it must matter. It must mean something. But sometimes memory doesn't reflect reality. It reflects emotional residue. It reflects what your inner child still aches to resolve. Gabor Maté speaks of how trauma isn't what happens to us, but what happens inside us as a result. So even small moments, a glance, a silence, a forgotten birthday can become monuments in the psyche when they land on an open wound. Your mind stores these emotionally loaded memories with extra emphasis. They come back easily, so they feel important. But ease of recall is not proof. It's habit. And emotional salience is not truth. It's impact. The story that returns most often might not be the truest, only the loudest. Imagine walking through a quiet field where wind moves gently through tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings, not because someone is calling, but because the wind touched the chime just right. That's what memory does. It rings in the presence of a familiar emotion. You feel abandoned today, and suddenly the mind sends you every moment you were ever left out. You feel unsure now, and the mind brings up every failure you thought you'd forgotten. These aren't neutral facts. They're echoes pulled forward not by logic, but by need to make sense, need to validate emotion, need to confirm the identity you've carried for so long. But what if those memories aren't fixed? What if they're fluid? Like water poured into a new container. Every time you recall them, studies show that every act of remembering is also an act of reshaping. You don't retrieve a memory like a file, you reconstruct it. Each time, slightly different. Tinted by mood, colored by the present. So the stories you tell yourself, even if they began in truth, may now be more reflection than record, more feeling than fact. There's a paradox here. The more emotional a memory, the more vivid it becomes, and the more likely it is to be altered. You think of your worst moments, and they burn bright, but that brightness doesn't guarantee accuracy. It guarantees intensity. And intensity tricks the brain into believing. So you walk around carrying convictions like I always mess up, people always leave, no one sees me, not because you've run the math, but because the emotion attached to those stories is too strong to ignore. The mind, overwhelmed by feeling, assumes significance. But feeling is not evidence. It is only a signal, a call to pause, to breathe, to question the lens. Softly now, what stories are easiest for you to reach? What memories repeat without invitation? What loops play in the background of your quiet moments? Could it be that your brain is replaying not because the content is urgent, but because the emotion has nowhere else to go? The looping thought, the intrusive image, the repeated doubt, they are not punishments. They are processes, unfinished cycles. A part of you years ago couldn't fully process what happened. So your mind keeps returning not to torture you, but to complete the loop. It's not always about resolution. Sometimes it's just about recognition. Saying, yes, I remember. Yes, that mattered. And yes, I'm still here. Now widen the lens. Philosophy reminds us memory is not a camera, it's a painter. And the painter is moody, impressionistic, driven by symbolism and emotion. We want to believe we remember things as they happen, but more often we remember how they felt. And then we build a narrative to match. That narrative becomes identity. Identity becomes filter, and the loop continues. But perhaps the point isn't to silence the stories. Perhaps the point is to understand which ones you've kept because they feel like home, and whether that home still fits you now. Picture an old cassette tape left too long in the sun. The music is still there, but warped, stretched, a little slower in places, a little sharper in others. That's your memory. It plays, but not exactly as recorded. And you keep pressing play, hoping it will tell you something new, but it tells you what it always has, until you ask what else might be true. What moments don't come to mind? Not because they didn't happen, but because they don't fit the story I've chosen. What quiet kindness, what unseen success, what simple joy has been. Lost in the shuffle of more dramatic, painful memories. You are not dishonest for remembering things this way. You are human. And the human mind is a storyteller. But tonight you can choose to notice the script. You can notice the emotional narrator behind your memories. And in that noticing, you create space, not to erase the past, but to see it softer, clearer, with compassion. What feels true isn't always what is true. Sometimes it's just what you've practiced the longest, and that practice can change. You see a face in the clouds, a message in the stars, a coincidence that feels too perfect to be random. Somewhere deep inside, you feel it must mean something, that it was meant to happen, that the universe is whispering to you. And maybe it is. Or maybe your mind is doing what it has always done, finding patterns where none exist. We are meaning-making creatures born into chaos, craving order. So the brain connects dots, draws shapes, invents stories. It does this not because it's flawed, but because it longs for coherence, for a sense of cause and effect, for a thread that ties together the unpredictable. This is apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaning in randomness. A rustle in the grass becomes a predator. A repeated number becomes a sign. A stranger saying your name becomes fate. It's not logic. It's pattern recognition turned up too high. And it's something every human does all the time. Sometimes it's harmless, sometimes it's beautiful, and sometimes it traps us. Imagine you've been hurt in love, left suddenly without closure. Now every romantic gesture feels like a warning sign. Every silence feels ominous. You begin to notice things you would have ignored before: small inconsistencies, tiny changes in tone, delays in texting back. Your mind connects them like constellations. A picture forms. You think it's happening again, but is it? Or is your brain clustering random events into a story trying to protect you from repeating the same pain? This is the clustering illusion, a subset of apophenia, where we see patterns in small samples that don't really exist. Your mind tells you, I've seen this before, but it might only feel familiar because the emotion is familiar, not the facts. Jung called this phenomenon synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that feel connected even without a clear cause. Two people think of each other and text at the same moment. A book falls off a shelf and opens to the exact quote you needed. A dream matches a real-life event. To Jung, this wasn't irrational. It was a signal of the psyche's deeper layers aligning with the world around it. An invitation to listen. Not necessarily to find answers, but to dwell in wonder. But even Jung warned synchronicity is not proof of magic. It is an archetypal language, symbolic, not literal. The problem arises when we turn every alignment into a prophecy. When we believe every repeated number is a sign, every coincidence a message, we stop seeing what is and instead see what we want or fear. The brain creates constellations and then forgets that it created them. Think of your thoughts like ink dropped in water. The shapes are fluid, shifting, beautiful, but not fixed. You can see a dragon, a dancer, a doorway, but the water didn't create them. You did. Your perception pulls out meaning guided by your inner needs, a need for control, a need for explanation, a need for closure. And in that pulling the ink forms images, not because they were planted there by some external hand, but because the psyche cannot bear chaos without context. And so we shape the formless into something we can hold, into stories. There's a paradox in this. The more uncertain we feel, the more meaning we invent. Studies show that when people experience randomness, they become more likely to see illusory patterns. In a time of grief, they might believe a bird visiting their window is the soul of a loved one. After a breakup, they might believe the song playing at the store is the universe mocking them. The mind weaves the emotional and the external into a single tapestry, and that tapestry feels real, but it's stitched from inner threads. The universe may not be trying to say anything, or maybe it is, but in a language deeper than words, one that only resonates when you stop searching for proof and start listening from within. So here's a gentle question. When was the last time you mistook coincidence for certainty? When did your brain connect moments into a pattern? Not because they belonged together, but because you needed needed a reason, a meaning, a warning, a hope. These patterns are not delusions. They are invitations. They ask you to pause, to reflect, to wonder, why did I need this to mean something? What longing inside me is being answered by this connection I've made? What fear is being soothed? Imagine a night sky full of stars. At first, it's just chaos points of light scattered across a black void, but then someone draws lines between them, and now you see Orion, Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper. You believe you're seeing the truth, but you're seeing a map created by myth. Still, the stars haven't moved. Only your interpretation has. That's the beauty and danger of the human mind. It makes maps. It tells stories. It draws meaning on the face of the unknown, and it can forget that the lines were never part of the stars themselves. This doesn't mean you should stop listening to your intuition. It doesn't mean you must dismantle every story you tell. It means learning to hold your interpretations lightly, to say, maybe this means something, maybe it doesn't. But either way, I can be present. You don't have to believe every pattern. You can notice it and let it float. You can admire the constellation without forgetting that it was drawn by human hands. Not everything is a message, but not everything is meaningless. Some patterns speak to something real, not outside you, but within. They reflect your fears, your dreams, your questions. They are symbols, not signs, mirrors, not maps. They don't point to a destination. They show you the terrain of your own mind, So tonight, as your thoughts drift, notice the shapes they form, the stories they create. Ask, is this a message from the world or a message from me to me? And either way, what is it asking me to feel? To remember, to let go of? You are the stargazer and the storyteller. And somewhere in the middle, between the silence of the stars and the noise of the mind, something tender waits. Not truth, not illusion, just awareness. And that is enough. You walk past a mirror and catch a glimpse of yourself, but something feels off. Not in your appearance, but in the way you're looking back. You hesitate, then shrug it off. You assume you're objective, that your mind is measuring the world and yourself with clarity. But here's the strange truth. You can spot the biases in others so easily. Their contradictions, their flawed logic, their blind spots. Yet when it comes to your own, your mind goes quiet, defends, justifies. This is the bias blind spot, the tendency to believe you're less biased than other people, a kind of meta bias. You're biased about your own bias, and that makes it almost impossible to detect. It's not arrogance necessarily, it's structure. The very part of your brain that would spot the distortion is the part doing the distorting. You become both the magician and the audience, both the storyteller and the listener. And in that duality, illusion feels like insight. You might find yourself saying, I see things clearly, I'm just logical, but the truth is your logic is layered with invisible loyalties. You're loyal to the version of yourself you've worked hard to protect. You're loyal to the beliefs that have gotten you through dark nights. You're loyal to conclusions that make you feel in control, and anything that threatens those, any fact, any idea, any person is quietly filed away as wrong, exaggerated, or not relevant. You don't even notice it happening because your mind has already decided. And now it's building a case to defend that decision. This is not thinking. This is post-rationalizing. And we all do it constantly. We think we're reasoning our way to the truth. But often we've already arrived and we're just building roads backward to justify where we landed. There's something deeply human about this, something childlike. The inner child, that part of you that once felt small, unprotected, misunderstood, it doesn't want to be wrong. Because being wrong might mean being unsafe, being bad, being unlovable. So you protect that child with certainty. You wrap them in conclusions that keep their world predictable, but predictability is not the same as reality, and safety is not the same as growth. Carl Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But that's only true if you're willing to ask, what if I do this too? What if the flaws I see so clearly in others are simply the ones I've hidden best in myself? What if my clarity about the world is in part a defense against seeing my own distortions? This doesn't mean you're dishonest. It means you're human. The ego isn't a villain. It's a filter, a mirror curved ever so slightly to flatter, to soften, to protect. Imagine standing in a hall of mirrors. Some elongate, some shrink, some fracture the image into 1,000 pieces. You walk through looking for one that feels most accurate. You find it. You pause. It reflects back a version of you that feels real. But is it? Or is it just the version that supports the story you like best, that justifies your pain, that avoids your shame, that protects your pride? The bias blind spot makes this mirror feel like glass, like truth, like objectivity, but the curve is there. It's just subtle enough that you stop noticing it. Psychologists have studied this. Even when people are shown clear evidence that humans are prone to bias, they continue to believe they're less susceptible than others. It's comforting to believe that we are the clear thinkers in a sea of delusion, but that very belief is a delusion. And here lies the paradox. The smarter you are, the better you become at rationalizing your distortions. Intelligence doesn't protect you from bias, it can deepen it. Because now you have better tools to defend your conclusions, even if they're wrong. So what do you do with this? Do you doubt every thought? Do you unravel every belief? No, that's not the path. The path is softer, slower. It begins with humility, with gently holding your certainty in open hands, with asking, what if I'm wrong and still okay? What if I don't have to defend this belief to be worthy? What if seeing my own distortion is not shameful, but sacred? When you notice bias in someone else, let it be a mirror, not to blame, not to moralize, but to reflect. Ask, what do I recognize in them that I struggle to face in me? Where am I convinced I'm neutral, when really I'm just comfortable? What parts of my worldview have never been challenged because I've never allowed them to be? These questions don't dismantle you. They deepen you. In the cosmos, there are objects called gravitational lenses, massive galaxies that bend the light of more distant stars, creating an illusion, rings, arcs, distortions. The light still arrives, but it arrives changed. That's your mind. Your emotional history is the galaxy. Your beliefs are the lens, and reality, raw, distant, radiant, bends as it passes through. You think you're seeing the source, but you're seeing its curvature. And still, this isn't failure. This is the architecture of being alive. No one sees purely. No one escapes distortion, but you can learn to notice the bend, to say softly, this is how my mind protects me. This is how my ego keeps me safe. And maybe I can loosen the grip. Just enough to see a little more, to hear something new, to let the mirror reflect, not just protect. You won't ever be bias-free, but you can be bias-aware. You can stop believing that your clarity is unique and start seeing it as a starting point, not an end point. You can walk into your own hall of mirrors, not to shatter them, but to understand their curves, to gently ask, what have I been trying to preserve? And what am I now ready to release? Because objectivity isn't a destination. It's a practice, one built not from certainty but from curiosity, from the courage to say, maybe I don't see the whole picture, but I want to, and in that wanting something shifts. A crack in the mirror, a new line of light, a softer gaze, a deeper truth. You remember it clearly, or at least you think you do. That moment in the kitchen, the words that stung, the way someone made you feel small. You replay it, often maybe in arguments, maybe in therapy, maybe in silence before sleep. You're sure of how it happened, the order, the tone, the meaning. But here's the quiet discomfort: memory is not a recording. It's a reconstruction. Each time you recall it, you rebuild it, subtly, altered, slightly edited, shaped by who you are now and how you feel now. You don't retrieve memories like books from a shelf. You rewrite them like dreams on water, and each time the version becomes more vivid, more convincing, and sometimes less accurate. This is the paradox of hindsight bias and false memory. Your mind remembers the past, not as it was, but as it needs it to be. Think of it like this: memory is less about what happened and more about what your brain decided was important. It doesn't store events like a camera. It stores fragments, emotion, smell, tone, symbols. It fills in the blanks later, often without your permission. And the more emotionally charged a memory is, the more likely it is to be distorted, not out of deception, but out of protection. If a moment made you feel ashamed, your mind might exaggerate it to justify that feeling. If a moment made you feel betrayed, your mind might edit out any ambiguity to make the betrayal feel absolute. The past becomes cleaner, simpler, more aligned with the story you now tell. But in that simplicity, something gets lost: complexity, nuance, truth. You might remember your childhood as colder than it was. You might forget the small kindnesses between the wounds. You might recall a conversation with perfect clarity, except the other person remembers it completely differently. This isn't because one of you is lying. It's because memory is deeply personal. Two people can experience the same event and walk away with entirely different internal films. This creates a strange tension, the illusion of shared reality, and the private architecture of personal memory. You believe you remember what happened, but what you really remember is how it felt, how it impacted you, and those feelings become the scaffolding for the story. Here's where hindsight bias creeps in. After something happens, especially something painful, your mind reshapes the past to make the outcome feel inevitable. I knew it, you tell yourself. I saw the signs. But did you, or are you, reinterpreting earlier moments through the lens of what you now know? You retroactively apply meaning foresight patterns. Not because they were there, but because your brain craves resolution. And resolution often means turning ambiguity into certainty, complexity into clarity, doubt into I told you so. It feels better to believe you saw it coming. It hurts less than admitting you were surprised. And so your memory shifts a quiet alchemy. You don't notice it, but slowly the past becomes aligned with the present self, not the past truth. Carl Jung said that the psyche constantly works to integrate unconscious material into conscious awareness, but memory can also resist this integration. It can keep trauma frozen, or worse, distorted to keep old identity structures intact. If you believe you're unlovable, your mind will shape memory to support that. If you see yourself as a failure, you will emphasize the moments that match. This isn't about lying to yourself. It's about surviving the self. The inner child clings to patterns that made sense, even if they hurt. And so when you recall a fight, a goodbye, a silence, you might unconsciously amplify the parts that validate your identity. Because if the pain had a clear cause, then the world still makes sense. But what if it wasn't that simple? What if your memory is incomplete? Not because you're broken, but because you're human. What if the story you've told yourself about that moment isn't wrong, but partial, incomplete, like a puzzle with corners missing? Could you live with that ambiguity? Could you let go of being right about the past in order to be more present now? Imagine holding a photograph that's been folded and unfolded too many times. The edges are worn, a crease runs through someone's face, the colors are fading, the light is off. That's how memory works. It's not perfect, it's not fixed, it's not even fully yours. It's been touched by time, by emotion, by repetition, and yet you stare at it as if it holds the whole truth, as if it's proof. But maybe it's just a symbol, a representation of how it felt to be you back then. And maybe the point isn't to correct it, but to understand what it reveals about what still aches, still echoes, still hasn't been seen. Psychologists call this reconstructive memory, the idea that remembering is a creative act, not a passive one. You build the memory anew each time, which means each act of remembering is also a chance to revise, not to erase, but to soften, to see new angles, to question the finality. You can't change the past, but you can change your relationship to it. You can move from this is what happened to this is how I remember it, and what that memory still means. So here's the soft question tonight. Which memories return most often? And what identity do they reinforce? What part of you feels seen in them? And what part stays hidden? Could you hold those memories with a gentler hand? Could you say, this shaped me? Yes, but it doesn't have to define me. Could you allow space for another version of the past? Not to cancel the first, but to coexist with it. A version where you weren't just hurt, but also resilient, where you weren't just left, but also survived, where the moment wasn't just the end, but also a beginning. Because memory, like identity, is fluid, and the past is not a prison, it is a reflection. One you can learn to see more clearly the more you accept its imperfection. You may never know the full truth of what happened, but you can know yourself more deeply through how you carry it, through the stories that arise, through the weight that finally slowly begins to shift. You find yourself drawn to people who think like you, who agree with you, who echo your beliefs. It feels good, comforting, validating, like you're finally understood. But what if that comfort is also a trap? A soft enclosure built not from truth, but from repetition. You scroll through your feed, nodding along. You vent to a friend who reassures you, you're right, they were the problem. You read an article that confirms exactly what you already suspected. And with each affirmation, your belief strengthens, not because it's been challenged and survived, but because it's been echoed enough times to feel unshakable. This is the echo chamber, a psychological space where similar voices reinforce each other until outside perspectives sound not just wrong, but threatening. What begins as connection becomes insulation, and slowly, you forget how to hear anything else. Groupthink grows quietly here. The desire to belong outweighs the desire to question. You start to adjust your views, not from reflection, but from fear. Fear of being cast out, of seeming difficult, of making waves. So you nod along even when you're unsure. You laugh when everyone laughs, even if something inside you flinches. Over time, the inner compass grows faint. You stop asking, is this true for me? And start asking, will this make them like me? Adler's psychology tells us that human behavior is rooted in the striving for significance and belonging. And in echo chambers, both online and in real life, this striving turns into conformity, masked as clarity. You're not agreeing because it makes sense. You're agreeing because it feels safer than dissent. And it's not just external voices that shape your world. It's your own internal repetition, the same thoughts playing again and again, like a hallway of mirrors, reflecting your deepest fears and your strongest biases. If you've carried the belief, "I'm not enough," since childhood, your mind will attract relationships and environments that reflect it, not because you want to suffer, but because familiarity feels like home even when it hurts. You choose people who ignore you, conversations that devalue you, goals that exhaust you because they resonate with the echo inside. And every time it happens, you say, "See, this always happens to me," but maybe it happens because your inner echo is louder than your inner truth. And the more it bounces, the more convincing it becomes. Imagine walking into a cathedral where every whisper returns to you seconds later. At first, it's mesmerizing. You feel surrounded by your own voice, but after a while, you can't tell if what you're hearing is new or just your own thought reflected back again and again. That's what mental echo chambers feel like. And you don't even realize it's happening because it feels so familiar, like truth, like instinct. But instinct isn't always insight. Sometimes it's conditioning wearing the mask of clarity. This echo shows up in arguments. You assume someone's motive before they speak. You finish their sentence in your head. You reject their idea before it reaches your heart. Not because you're closed-minded, but because your past has trained you to anticipate pain. So you armor up, defend, attack. But what if your defensiveness is just an echo of an old wound? What if the volume in your head is drowning out what's actually being said? The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once said, "People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought, which they seldom use." It's harsh, but it touches something real. We speak often, but how often do we think beyond the thoughts we've rehearsed 1,000 times? How often do we notice the loop? The algorithm of our own cognition, built from trauma, repetition, and emotional necessity. Your brain loves predictability. It favors what's already known. Even your social media, your news feed, your daily conversations, they're curated by invisible algorithms that show you more of what you already believe. It becomes easy to forget that there are other valid experiences, other ways of being. You stop growing, not because you're incapable, but because you're not challenged. And challenge feels like danger when you've lived your life surviving on emotional autopilot. But here's the gentle paradox. What feels threatening at first might be freeing. The voice that challenges your belief may not be your enemy. It may be your invitation. The moment you feel defensive might be the moment worth leaning into. Not to agree, not to abandon yourself, but to widen, to stretch, to remember that truth doesn't echo, it vibrates, it surprises, it softens your certainty. Imagine a spiral staircase descending into a still chamber. At the center, there's silence. But before you get there, you pass through layers of noise voices you've heard 100 times. Your mother's tone, your father's silence, your teacher's warnings, your younger self's shame, all of them echoing, some loud, some faint. They repeat because they haven't been seen, not truly. And when you begin to see them, not obey them, not silence them, just, witness the echo begins to fade. The sound softens, you reach that center. And there in the stillness, a new thought arrives, one not shaped by fear, not carved from defense, but born of presence. So here's the soft question. What ideas have you never questioned? Because they've always been around you. What beliefs do you hold, not because you chose them, but because they were repeated? What part of you is tired of hearing the same story from your own mind. You are allowed to exit the hallway. You are allowed to hear something new, even if it contradicts the past, even if it shakes the echo, especially if it does. Because truth doesn't need to be, I just so loud. It just needs to be different. Quiet enough to notice, soft enough to land, clear enough to break the loop. You like to feel in control. You plan ahead. You double check. You keep your routines, your calendar, your guard. There's a certain peace that comes from predictability, a kind of safety in believing that you can steer the ship, that you are the one directing the flow. But what if that feeling is an illusion? What if the comfort of control is not a truth, but a story your mind tells you to ease anxiety? This is the illusion of control, a cognitive bias that leads you to overestimate your influence over events, even those governed by chance. You press the elevator button twice, you reread a message before sending it, you prepare for every possible outcome, not because it truly changes the result, but because it makes you feel less helpless. It gives your nervous system something to hold on to. You've been doing this for longer than you realize. As a child, maybe you sensed instability, a parent who was unpredictable emotions that weren't mirrored, needs that were unmet. And in that uncertainty, a strategy formed: if I stay ahead, I won't get hurt. If I can control the outcome, I won't feel abandoned. These weren't conscious decisions. They were adaptations, psychological survival mechanisms. Adler would call this goal-oriented behavior. You're not just reacting to the world, you're moving toward a subconscious goal of safety, even if that goal is built on a false premise. So you become the overthinker, the fixer, the planner. You try to manage not just your life, but how others perceive you, how they respond, how they feel. And when they react in ways you didn't predict, it feels like betrayal, not just of trust, but of the narrative you built to feel safe. But here's the soft tragedy. The more control you try to hold, the more tense you become. The more tightly you grip, the more brittle the illusion becomes. Life doesn't bend to your will. People don't follow your script. And deep down, you know this. You feel it in the frustration, the resentment, the exhaustion. You're trying to steer a ship in waters that have their own tide. And sometimes control becomes a form of fear, a way to avoid feeling small, powerless, vulnerable. But vulnerability is not weakness. It's what makes you real. And in chasing control, you may lose connection to yourself, to others, to the moment. Imagine holding a steering wheel in your hands. It looks real. It feels solid. You turn it left and right, believing it's guiding the vehicle, but then you realize it's not connected to anything. It spins, but nothing responds. This is the illusion of control. You're doing all the movements, but the outcome was never in your hands. That realization can feel terrifying, but it can also be freeing, because if you're not fully in control, then maybe it's not all your fault. Maybe you don't have to carry the blame for every failure. Maybe you don't have to hold your breath in every moment waiting for something to go wrong. Maybe you can let go just a little. Psychology tells us that letting go of control doesn't mean becoming passive. It means shifting from illusion to awareness, from overfunctioning to presence, from managing everything to meeting what is. Gabor Maté often speaks of how trauma teaches us to control in order to survive, but healing teaches us to feel, to risk the mess of unpredictability, to breathe through what can't be planned. So here's a soft question: where in your life are you gripping too tightly? What are you trying to control? Not because you need to, but because you're afraid of what might happen if you don't. Whose emotions are you managing? What outcomes are you secretly blaming yourself for? Can you offer yourself the grace of uncertainty? Think of a river. You can't shape its path by force, but you can learn to swim with it. You can navigate with awareness, not resistance. You can trust the current without surrendering your agency, because control and choice are not the same thing. Control is fear-driven. Choice is conscious. One reacts, the other responds. One contracts, the other expands. The cosmic metaphor is this: you are not the creator of every wave, but you are the surfer. You don't command the ocean, but you can learn its rhythm. You can fall, float, rise again. The wave does not listen to your fear, but it will meet your presence. And in that meeting, something opens. Not power, not certainty, but freedom. You are allowed to release the illusion. To say, I don't know, I can't control this, I trust myself even here. You are allowed to rest without a plan, to feel without fixing, to soften without falling apart, because sometimes life doesn't need to be held. It needs to be witnessed, and your worth was never measured by how well you kept it all together. You walk into a room and feel eyes on you. You stumble over your words and think everyone noticed. You obsess over the awkward pause, the stain on your shirt, the way your voice cracked during that one sentence. And even hours later, your mind replays it, convinced that others are still thinking about it too. But they're not. They've moved on. The spotlight that feels so blinding to you is invisible to them. This is the spotlight effect, the tendency to overestimate how much other people notice and judge your behavior. It's a distortion born not of vanity, but of vulnerability. You feel exposed not because you want attention, but because you fear rejection. You assume others see you the way you see yourself, under constant surveillance, under pressure to perform. It begins early. Maybe you were made to feel responsible for someone else's feelings, a parent's sadness, a teacher's approval, a sibling's silence. So you learned to scan the room. You paid attention to tone, to expression, to micro reactions. You became sensitive, hyper-aware. And that awareness, once a survival tool, became your default lens. You assume everyone is watching, judging, measuring. But in truth, most people are too consumed by their own insecurities to see yours clearly. They're inside their own spotlight, worrying about what you think of them. And so we move through the world, each imagining a stage where we are the main act, while in reality, everyone's theater is private. Adler believed that our striving for significance often manifests in subtle ways. The need to be seen, to be validated, to matter. And when that need isn't met with care, it mutates into self-consciousness. You become your own critic, imagining the world echoing your harshest thoughts. But here's the paradox: the more you think others are judging you, the more harshly you begin to judge yourself. You shrink not because anyone told you to, but because you imagined they were watching. The ego, trying to protect itself, creates a surveillance system where every misstep is amplified, every imperfection dissected. But what if no one's watching? What if the stage lights are off? What if the audience you fear is a projection, not of their gaze, but of your own? Carl Jung would say that the parts of ourselves we hide or disown, the shadow often get projected onto others. You fear their judgment because it mirrors your own. You worry they think you're foolish because deep down you haven't forgiven yourself for that old mistake. You assume they see your flaws because you've been rehearsing that inner monologue for years. The world becomes a mirror, reflecting not how others see you, but how you've learned to see yourself. Picture a spotlight shining on an empty stage. You stand in the beam, nervous, exposed, but then you step off the platform and realize the theater is empty. The seats are vacant. The silence is soft. The pressure wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from within. This is the gentle awakening the spotlight effect invites, to see how much of your anxiety is based not on others' thoughts, but on your fear of being unworthy. Social media amplifies this illusion. You post a photo and analyze every comment, every silence. You delete things that don't perform. You edit yourself before anyone even sees you. You curate your presence. But beneath the curation is a longing to be seen and accepted as you are. The irony is painful. The more you try to control perception, the further you move from authenticity. You perform to feel safe, but it's the mask that isolates you. So here's a soft question. What part of you are you most afraid others will see? And is that fear coming from them or from you? What would it feel like to walk into a room without bracing for judgment? To speak without scripting every word in advance, to show up not as a polished version, but as a present one. The truth is, most people aren't thinking about you the way you think they are. Not because you're unimportant, but because they're tangled in their own webs. You pass each other like ships in the fog, each imagining the other has a spotlight trained on them. But in reality, we're all carrying flashlights turned inward. And when someone does notice you really sees you, it's rarely the things you obsess over. It's your presence, your honesty, your humanness. Imagine a sky full of stars, each one shining, thinking it's alone in the dark. But from a distance, they form constellations patterns, only visible when the lights are held gently without fear. You are one of those lights. You don't need to dim yourself to avoid attention, and you don't need to burn brighter to be worthy. You just need to remember the spotlight isn't real. It was never built to expose you, only to distract you from the truth. You are not a performance. You are a presence. And presence doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to be here, whole, unapologetically quiet, and finally, free. You've been wrong before. You've believed things that turned out to be false, trusted people who didn't deserve it, held on to ideas that no longer serve you, and yet letting go of a belief still feels like a kind of death, a threat, a fracture in identity. You would rather double down than unravel. You would rather justify the pain than admit the premise was flawed. This is belief perseverance, a cognitive bias, where we cling to beliefs even after the evidence against them is clear. Not because we're stubborn, but because the belief has become part of who we are. To doubt it would be to doubt ourselves, and to doubt ourselves can feel like drowning. Maybe you were taught something early on about love, success, trust. Maybe someone hurt you and you drew a conclusion to keep yourself safe. People always leave. I have to earn affection. Nothing ever works out for me. At first, it was just a thought. But repeated enough times in enough painful moments, it became a belief. Then an identity, then a law of reality. And once something becomes identity, it stops being questioned. It becomes the lens through which all other thoughts are filtered. You don't just believe it, you are it. And the cost of disconfirming it becomes too high. Even freedom feels like loss when you've built yourself around chains. Cognitive dissonance begins to stir when new evidence arrives. Maybe someone shows you kindness you didn't expect. Maybe life goes right for once. Maybe you surprise yourself. But instead of relief, you feel confusion, unease. You might even sabotage it, not because you want to fail, but because your system can't tolerate the contradiction. The belief whispers, this is temporary, this isn't real. You return to the familiar pain because it makes more sense than unfamiliar peace. And so the belief is preserved, not because it's accurate, but because it feels safe. Carl Jung warned of the danger of identification when we become fused with a single role idea or wound. We mistake the mask for the face. We confuse survival strategies for personality. And the more we identify with a belief, the more we surround ourselves with people, media, and environments that reinforce it. We create a self-confirming world, a psychological ecosystem that supports our story. Even our memories get shaped by this narrative. We remember moments that support the belief and quietly forget the ones that don't. The self becomes a house of mirrors, all reflecting back the same conviction. But what if that house was built on outdated blueprints? What if you've grown, but the belief stayed the same? Adler would say that every belief serves a purpose, usually unconscious, usually protective. The belief, I can't trust anyone, may keep you from being hurt again. The belief, I always mess up, might lower expectations, so you're never disappointed. These are not lies. They are strategies, but strategies built during moments of emotional emergency may not serve the life you're trying to build now. The belief that once helped you survive may now be keeping you small. Imagine holding a rope that's frayed and knotted. You've held it so long, your hand has molded around it. It cuts you, it limits your reach. But the thought of letting go terrifies you because what if there's nothing else to hold on to? That's what belief perseverance feels like. You know it's hurting you, but you can't imagine who you'd be without it. The rope, for all its damage, feels safer than the empty hand. But the empty hand is also the beginning of a new grip, a new reach, a new way of meeting life. Not with preloaded certainty, but with presence, with curiosity, with the courage to say, I might have been wrong, and to let that be not a threat, but a sign of growth, a soft cracking of the shell, a shedding of skin. So here's a tender question. What beliefs are you still holding, not because they're true, but because they've become familiar? What ideas do you defend most fiercely, and why? What part of you is being protected by that defense? And what might happen? Not if you abandon the belief, but if you held it with a little more space, a little less certainty. Truth doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes as a pause, a hesitation, a quiet maybe. And in that, maybe the whole world can shift. You are not betraying your past by changing your mind. You are honoring your evolution. You are allowing the version of you that believed those things to step aside, not with shame, but with gratitude. That belief helped you once. But maybe it's time to choose something else, something softer, something that doesn't require so much defense. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest you've never entered. Behind you is the desert you've known forever, dry, predictable, familiar. Ahead is the unknown, moist earth, different sounds, no map. And the belief says, stay here. It's safe. But your body wants to move. Your spirit wants to try. Your breath wants to exhale something new. You don't have to run. Just one step, one belief loosened, one moment of doubt allowed to breathe. Because you are not your thoughts. You are not your beliefs. You are the space they move through. And in that space, change is not loss. It's liberation. You see someone trip and immediately assume they're clumsy. But when you trip, it was because the floor was uneven, or your shoes were slippery, or you were carrying too much. The story shifts depending on who it's about. When others make mistakes, we blame their character. When we fail, we blame circumstance. This is the fundamental attribution error, the cognitive bias that leads us to overestimate the role of personality in others' behavior and underestimate the role of context. We see their actions as reflections of who they are, but we see our own actions as reflections of what we're going through. It feels natural, fair even, but underneath it all, this bias quietly reinforces our defenses. It creates distance. It says, I'm trying, they're flawed. This split begins early. Maybe you grew up being judged quickly. No one asked why you acted out. They just punished the behavior. Maybe you had to explain yourself constantly while others were allowed to stay unexplained. So now as an adult, you crave to be understood deeply, compassionately. But when others disappoint or hurt you, it's hard to offer the same grace. You think they should know better. That's just how they are. Without meaning to you, harden. You judge what you fear in yourself. You project your inner critic outward, so the blame feels safer out there than in here. Psychologically, this is a form of ego defense. By attributing flaws to others' character, we shield ourselves from our own vulnerability. It's easier to believe someone is selfish than to sit with the pain of feeling ignored. It's easier to label someone lazy than to acknowledge they may be struggling, lost, or burnt out just like you've been. But the ego doesn't want complexity. It wants clarity, categories, sharp lines, good and bad, right and wrong. The paradox is, the more you try to see others clearly, the more your own lens gets in the way. Carl Jung warned that what we deny in ourselves often becomes the shadow we cast onto others. You hate the arrogance in them because you fear your own pride. You recoil at their chaos because it reminds you of your buried confusion. What you cannot hold in yourself, you refuse to see gently in others. And so perception becomes projection. Flaws become filters. You don't just observe, you judge. And you mistake judgment for truth. But what if there's more to every action than you can see? What if their anger is grief? Their silence is shame. Their lateness is fear of being seen. What if the traits that irritate you most in others are simply traits you haven't made peace with in yourself? You've been late. You've shut down. You've said the wrong thing. And when you did, you hoped someone would ask what happened instead of what's wrong with you. That same compassion, the kind you long for, can be offered too, but only when you soften your filter. Imagine a cracked lens. You look through it for so long that the distortion becomes normal, a bent world, crooked lines, misjudged angles. And then one day someone hands you a clean pane of glass. You hold it up, and suddenly the same scene looks different, softer, less defined, more alive. That's what awareness does. It doesn't demand that you never judge. It just invites you to notice the distortion, to ask, what story am I telling about this person? And what pain in me is writing it? Adler's psychology reminds us that behavior is purposeful, even when it looks irrational. The person who dominates every conversation may be terrified of being forgotten. The one who cancels plans last minute may be overwhelmed with guilt and paralysis. The friend who criticizes others may be echoing the voice that raised them. And maybe you've been all of these things too. Different costumes, same longing to belong, to be safe, to be enough. So here's the soft question. Who have you judged recently? And what if their behavior isn't who they are, but where they are? What if they're in a storm you can't see? And what if you are too? Could you hold space for both? Could you see the flaw and the fear behind it? The cosmic truth is that we're all stumbling through this life with fractured lenses. And sometimes clarity isn't about cleaning the glass. It's about remembering that everyone else is looking through their own too. We misinterpret, we misjudge, we assume, and yet somewhere beneath the distortion, we all want the same thing: to be seen as whole, not just summed up, to be understood beyond our worst moments, to be forgiven before we've even explained. So take a breath, loosen the story, offer the benefit of the doubt, not because they've earned it, but because you deserve to live in a world where people are more than the worst thing they've done. That world starts in your mind, in your gaze, in the small, sacred space between reaction and reflection. Because how you see others is often a reflection of how deeply you've allowed yourself to be seen. And when you stop using flaws as filters, the world becomes less sharp, less cruel, and a little more human. You stand in front of a menu and feel overwhelmed, not because the options are bad, but because there are too many. You scroll endlessly through job listings, dating apps, online stores. You make pros and cons lists that never resolve. You stall, you stress. And in the quiet behind your eyes, a question hums, what if I choose wrong? We think freedom lies in options, but sometimes too much choice becomes its own kind of trap. A maze without walls, a room with too many doors. The more possibilities you have, the more responsibility you feel, the more pressure, the more regret. And this is choice overload, the cognitive bias, where too many options lead to anxiety paralysis and dissatisfaction, even when we eventually make a decision. The paradox is cruel. The modern world gives you more autonomy than any generation before, and yet you feel more uncertain, more unanchored. You tell yourself, I should be grateful. But beneath that, something aches. Because with each choice comes not just a commitment, but the grief of the unchosen. Every yes is 1,000 quiet no's. Every path splits the future. And so instead of moving, you hesitate. You cling to potential, to the illusion of the perfect option, the job without flaws, the partner without shadows, the timing without risk. But perfection is a myth your mind conjures when it's afraid of change. The anchoring bias makes this worse. It's the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information you receive, the first salary offered, the first impression, the first expectation someone placed on you. Even when better options appear, you hesitate to veer too far from the anchor. You tell yourself, this is what people like me do, or this is what I always planned, even when that plan no longer fits. You mistake commitment for integrity when sometimes letting go is the deeper kind of truth. Alfred Adler taught that all behavior is goal-driven, even when it feels stuck. If you delay a decision, perhaps the goal isn't clarity, but safety. If you keep all options open, perhaps the goal isn't abundance, but avoidance. The inner child may still fear being blamed for getting it wrong, may still believe love is conditional on being perfect, and so the adult hesitates, revisits, spins, not out of laziness, but out of fear. Carl Jung would say this fear stems from the shadow, the unseen parts of us that dread responsibility, dread regret, dread being seen as flawed. And so we keep choice theoretical, safer in the mind than in the world. But unchosen life still costs us. There is pain in every path, even the ones we don't take. And often we carry the weight of decisions, unmade, more heavily than any mistake we've actually lived through. Imagine holding a compass that spins endlessly. North keeps shifting. The more you try to fix your direction, the more disoriented you become. That's what modern decision-making can feel like. But here's the shift. What if there's no right direction? What if the goal isn't to find the perfect answer, but to move forward and meet who you become along the way? The peace you seek might not be in the decision itself, but in the willingness to stop seeking perfect peace through perfect choices. You can ask yourself softer questions, not what's the best option, but what can I live with? What feels honest, even if it's scary? What small risk can I take today, even without certainty? These questions don't erase regret, but they bring you into relationship with it. You begin to see that regret is not proof you chose wrong. It's proof you're growing, that you're brave enough to move to try to care. So here's the deeper invitation. Can you let go of being right and choose to be real? Can you make decisions from presence, not perfectionism? Can you live with the ache of not knowing and still move anyway? Picture a garden path. It forks into 5 directions. You can stand there frozen, or you can pick one and walk. The paths are winding, none are straight, some double back, some intersect, none lead to certainty, but all lead to experience, all lead to self. And the one you choose is the one you'll come to understand. Freedom is not the absence of limits, it's the courage to live within them and to keep walking. Even when your hands shake, even when the compass spins, even when the voices say, "What if?" louder than your breath. Because movement creates clarity, commitment creates meaning, and you create the rest. One choice, one quiet step, one imperfect direction at a time. You stay in the job that drains you. You hold on to the relationship that no longer nourishes you. You repeat the same argument with yourself with others, even when you already know how it ends. You tell yourself it's just not the right time to change, that maybe things will shift on their own. But if you're honest, the deeper truth is simpler. The discomfort you know feels safer than the possibility you don't. This is the status quo bias, the unconscious tendency to prefer things as they are simply because they are, not because they're good, not because they're aligned, but because they're familiar. And the familiar feels survivable. This bias isn't about logic, it's about emotional memory. Somewhere in your past, chaos may have arrived without warning, a move, a breakup, a silence that changed everything. And from that moment, stability became sacred. Even if it hurt, even if it numbed you, even if it kept you from growing, you built rituals, habits, predictable rhythms, because unpredictability felt like danger, because peace, no matter how limited, was better than uncertainty. The inner child made a deal. I'll stay small if it means I won't be surprised again. So now, when change calls your mind, hesitates, it doesn't ask, is this new path better? It asks, can I survive not knowing? And often, the answer feels like no. So you cling to what is the job, the city, is the belief, the version of you that no longer fits. You tell yourself it's for the best, that others have it worse, that you should be grateful. And all of that may be true. But so is this, your longing is also real. And ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just turns the ache inward. Carl Jung said, we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness here is not dramatic. It's subtle. It's the quiet inertia that keeps you rooted in places you've outgrown. It's the voice that says, this is just who I am, when your spirit whispers, but what if we could be more? It's the way you normalize the ache, call it adulthood, and move on. But healing asks more of you, not reckless leaps, just small honesty, a willingness to admit that the comfort you're protecting may not be comfort at all, just repetition, just memory, just muscle. Adler's psychology reminds us that even maladaptive behaviors serve a purpose. The purpose here is emotional safety. And emotional safety is valid, but if it becomes a prison, it needs to be questioned. Imagine a locked room. It's dim, but you know every corner, every creak of the floorboards, every crack in the wall. You tell yourself it's home, but one day you notice the lock isn't real. It was never locked. You just never tried the handle. That's the status quo. It convinces you the door is sealed because it's easier than admitting you've had a choice all along, and choices are frightening because they demand responsibility. They require risk. They invite change. So here's a soft question. What have you been calling normal that might actually be numbing? What patterns feel safe but leave you empty? What routines comfort you? Not because they bring joy, but because they ask nothing new of you. This doesn't mean you must uproot your life. Sometimes the biggest act of rebellion is simply pausing long enough to feel the desire for change. To say I'm not okay here without immediately fixing it, without rushing into another version of control, just breathing with the discomfort, just listening. The cosmos doesn't evolve by staying the same. Stars are born from collapse. Forests regenerate through fire. The natural order is one of continual becoming. You are not meant to stay who you were, even if that version of you was beloved, even if it once protected you, especially if it did. Letting go doesn't mean you failed. It means you're making space for breath, for growth, for the part of you that doesn't yet have words. There's no guarantee the new path will be easier, but staying still out of fear is a choice, too, one that costs more the longer you make it. So tonight, listen gently to the part of you that's restless, to the thought you keep pushing away, to the version of you whispering from just beyond the threshold of what you've known, not asking for a revolution, just a step, a shift, a sigh of readiness. You don't need to leave everything behind. You just need to stop pretending that familiarity is the same thing as freedom, because it's not. And deep down, you already know. You meet someone, and within seconds, you decide they're confident, they're cold. They're the kind of person who you don't even realize you're doing it. Your brain makes a quick sketch, one that becomes the framework for everything that follows. If they smile, it confirms your impression. If they frown, you reinterpret it. First impressions aren't just fast, they're sticky. And this is anchoring bias in action. The mind's tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information when forming judgments. Once that first impression takes hold, it becomes the anchor. Everything else gets tethered to it, even if it's not true, even if you miss something important, even if the context changes. You do this not just with others, but with yourself. You label yourself early, maybe as the quiet one, the anxious one, the helper. Maybe someone else labeled you first and you accepted it. A teacher, a parent, a moment in adolescence. And now, decades later, you still feel the gravitational pull of that identity. When you fail, you say, "Of course I did." When you succeed, you brush it off. You anchor yourself to the version of you that formed under pressure. Not because it's still accurate, but because it's familiar, comfortable, known. Then comes the halo effect, a cognitive distortion, where one positive trait colors the rest of the person. If someone is attractive, we assume they're also kind. If someone is articulate, we assume they're competent. And the opposite happens, too. If someone is awkward, we might judge them as unintelligent. If they make one mistake, we start to doubt everything else. It's not fair, but it's human. We long for coherence, for simplicity. It takes less energy to decide once and stick to it than to stay open, curious, changing. And so we filter new information through old beliefs. Jung spoke of the persona, the mask we wear, to meet the expectations of the outer world. First impressions often capture the persona, not the person. But we don't see the mask. We see what we want to believe, or what we fear, or what fits our worldview. And so we miss people. We miss depth. We miss complexity. We see what they projected or what we needed, not who they truly are. Adler would add that we form early conclusions about life and self during childhood, and these lifestyle decisions become the invisible script we follow. If you were seen as the responsible one, you anchor to that even when you're falling apart. If you were treated as the failure, you internalize it even when you succeed. The anchoring isn't just cognitive, it's emotional. Your nervous system memorizes who you had to be to stay loved, and it holds you there like a ship moored to a dock you've long since outgrown. But what if your anchor is outdated? What if the impression someone formed of you years ago was never accurate to begin with? And what if the impression you formed of yourself in pain, in survival, in confusion, no longer fits the life you're living now? Imagine painting over a canvas again and again. The first layer still shapes the texture. It still peeks through in the cracks. That's how anchoring works. The original belief doesn't disappear, but you can choose new layers. You can decide that the first sketch doesn't get the final word. You can say, this was who I thought I was, but I'm not finished. So here's the soft question. What impressions are you still living inside? What roles have you accepted without revisiting? What stories about others or about yourself have gone unquestioned for too long? And what would it mean to begin again, to meet someone as they are now, including you? It's okay to admit you were wrong about someone, about yourself. That's not weakness, that's freedom. That's how the anchor loosens. That's how the story widens. When you say, maybe there's more here than I first saw, you don't just open the door for others, you open it for yourself. Picture a mirror fogged by breath. At first, you only see outlines, a silhouette, a hint, and then slowly the glass clears. The shape remains, but now there are details, scars, softness, light. You didn't invent a new image. You just allowed the truth to emerge. You are not the impression someone formed of you in a rushed moment. You are not the role you played in someone else's narrative. You are not stuck inside the first sentence of your story. And neither is anyone else. The page is still turning. The ink is still wet. So let the anchor drift a little. Let the mask slip. Let the new version of you and them be seen, not defined by what came first, but discovered over time, with grace, with space, with the humility to say, I'm still learning how to see. You said you make a choice and almost instantly wonder what you've given up. You win something, and the first thing your mind does is calculate what it cost. You avoid risk, not because you're sure it will fail, but because you're haunted by the image of what you might lose if it doesn't work. This is loss aversion, one of the strongest cognitive biases we carry. It means we feel the pain of losing something almost twice as intensely as we feel the joy of gaining something equal. It distorts our decisions, not toward what we want, but away from what we fear, even if what we fear is only imagined. Maybe you've hesitated to leave a relationship even when your heart was already gone because the thought of losing what you once had or what it could have been outweighed the reality of what it is. Maybe you've stayed in a job, a city, a belief, not because it fits, but because walking away would make you feel like a failure. So you endure. You hold tight, not to the thing itself, but to the story of what you'd be without it. You believe you'd be empty, that something real would be gone, even if it's been gone for a while now. This isn't foolish, it's deeply human. The inner child remembers every time something was taken without your consent, every time the goodbye came too early, every time you didn't get to choose what was lost. And now, even as an adult, the fear of loss isn't just about things, it's about control, about not being that powerless again. So your nervous system reacts. It says, better to keep what's broken than risk having nothing. Gabor Maté reminds us that trauma isn't just what happened to us, it's what we had to leave behind in ourselves in order to survive it. That loss, the internal one, often remains invisible. But the body remembers. The psyche grieves it over and over each time something or someone threatens to go. So we build lives around avoiding that feeling, around staying one step ahead of potential grief. But in doing so, we often grieve what never got a chance to live. There's a paradox here. The more you try to avoid loss, the more you lose. You lose freedom, aliveness, joy. You say no to the new before it even arrives. You weigh your options, not by desire, but by how painful the absence would be. You live preemptively in regret. You imagine the worst-case scenario as a guidepost, and then wonder why everything feels so heavy. Adler might say this is a misdirected goal, a psychological strategy meant to protect meaning, but that ends up stifling it. You think you're being cautious, but really you're protecting the version of you that once had no choice. And now, given the freedom to choose, you freeze. Not because you don't want to move, but because the echo of old loss is louder than your current truth. Imagine standing at a scale. You place a small stone on one side, the opportunity, the new direction, the unknown. And before you even add anything to the other side, your hand presses down hard on the weight of what could go wrong. It's not a fair measure. It's fear disguised as realism. It's your past disguised as your instinct. But what if loss is not always a wound, but a doorway? What if releasing something is not proof of failure, but an act of faith? Faith that you are not defined by what you keep. That absence is not always a threat. That letting go creates space. And space is where life breathes in. So here's the soft question. What are you holding on to, not because it nourishes you, but because you're afraid to feel the emptiness it would leave behind? What might that emptiness actually hold if you let it speak? Could it be grief? Could it be relief? Could it be the version of you that never had permission to begin again? The cosmos knows loss intimately. Stars collapse to make room for galaxies. Trees shed leaves to survive winter. Even your own body lets go of cells daily quietly without drama. Loss is not the end. It's a rhythm, a breath out before a new inhale. You are allowed to let go of roles, of patterns, of people who no longer meet you, not with bitterness, not with certainty, but with softness, with the understanding that some things are beautiful and not meant to stay, that some chapters end without villains, that some partings are not about giving up, but about growing up. Let yourself feel the loss fully, without flinching. And then notice what remains, the open hand, the quiet heart, the faint light on the horizon. Not hope, maybe, but room. And room is where your next life begins. You're so sure sometimes about how things will go, about what they meant, about who you are. Certainty feels good, clean, solid, final. Like something you can lean on when everything else feels unstable. But what if that certainty is an illusion, a fiction your mind writes to soothe its fear of the unknown? This is the overconfidence effect, a bias where people overestimate the accuracy of their knowledge, judgments, and memory. It doesn't matter how complex the issue is. If it supports our beliefs, we become more certain, more entrenched, and often less correct. The paradox is strange. The more uncertain the world becomes, the more certain we pretend to be, not because we know, but because we need to believe we know. We say, I just know they were lying. I'm sure I'll fail. They're definitely judging me. We make predictions and decisions based on fragments of evidence guided more by emotion than logic. We trust our gut, even when our gut is echoing old wounds, not present wisdom. But here's where it gets tender. The need for certainty usually doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of feeling small. Fear of admitting, I don't know. You might have grown up in an environment where being wrong meant being punished, where not knowing meant being overlooked. So you learned to speak with confidence, to act with conviction, to move quickly even when unsure, because hesitation was dangerous, because vulnerability invited shame. Carl Jung warned that when the conscious mind clings to a rigid story, the unconscious begins to rebel. It sends dreams, symptoms, projections, subtle attempts to loosen your grip on the story. And the more tightly you hold it, the more distorted your inner world becomes. Certainty becomes a cage and your deeper self starts rattling the bars. Adler would say that When we lock into a fixed belief, I'm the responsible one, I can't trust people, life never goes my way, we're not describing reality. We're describing a goal, a purpose, often unconscious. The belief serves us even when it hurts. It justifies our behavior. It protects our vulnerability. It gives us an identity, but that identity becomes brittle, inflexible, defended, and anything that challenges it is met with resistance, not because it's false, but because it threatens the architecture we've built to feel safe. You begin to notice this in the little moments, the way you interrupt someone before they finish, because you already know what they're going to say. The way you dismiss a new idea, not because it's wrong, but because it contradicts what you've held for so long. The way you tell the same story about yourself, even when it no longer fits. You aren't trying to deceive. You're trying to feel real. But the truth is, your identity is not a fact. It's a process, and certainty often interrupts that process too soon. Imagine a castle built on clouds. From afar, it looks strong, symmetrical, grand, but step inside and you feel the floor sway. The walls shift. It doesn't collapse, it drifts, because it was never built to hold the weight of all your knowing, only the shape of your longing. So here's the soft question. What are you too sure about right now? What belief, if loosened, might make room for a deeper truth? Not one that replaces the old, but one that holds its contradiction. Can you sit with the phrase, "I'm not sure," and still feel whole? Philosophy reminds us that wisdom begins with humility. Socrates said, "I know that I know nothing," not as a confession of ignorance, but as a celebration of openness. When you let go of being right, you gain the ability to see more, to learn more, to live wider, to respond instead of react, to hold your beliefs with tenderness instead of tightness. You are allowed to doubt, to evolve, to say, that used to be true for me, but it no longer is. You are allowed to change your mind without shame, to let go of needing the world or yourself to make perfect sense, because it won't. And the moment you stop demanding that it should, something softer enters. Wonder, curiosity, presence. Picture a spiral staircase in the dark. You don't see where it leads, only the next step. And yet you climb, not because you're certain of the destination, but because you trust the movement. You trust that step by step, something will reveal itself. Not clarity, perhaps, but depth. And depth is enough. You don't need to be sure. You need to be honest with yourself, with the shifting nature of your mind, with the stories that once held you and now constrain you. The mind wants clarity, but the soul thrives in mystery. So tonight, release the need to know, to conclude, to define. Let your thoughts drift like clouds, unheld, unnamed. Let yourself wonder without rushing to answer. You are not the sum of your conclusions. You are the space between them, quiet, expansive, awake. So here we are, at the edge of all these thoughts, these patterns, these quiet tricks of the mind. You began this journey believing that what you think must be real, that your memories were facts, that your instincts were truth. But now, maybe you see it differently. Not with judgment, not with shame, but with softness, with a kind of reverent curiosity. Because the more you observe your mind, the more you realize it isn't lying to hurt you. It's protecting you, even when it distorts, even when it loops, even when it clings to old beliefs that no longer fit. It's just trying to make sense of things, to give shape to the shapeless, to create safety where there was once none. And in seeing that, you don't need to fight the bias. You don't need to fix the flaw. You can just notice with breath, with space, with a gentle knowing that awareness itself is already healing. The filters may not vanish, but they soften when you name them. You start to question the certainty. You start to forgive the reaction. You start to ask better questions, not What's wrong with me, but what is this trying to protect? Not why am I like this, but what happened that made this feel necessary? The story opens. The grip loosens. The present moment becomes a little wider, a little quieter, a little more yours. You are not broken. You are patterned. And those patterns were once brilliant strategies, clever, fast, protective. But now you have time. You have space. You have choice. And that choice begins in awareness, in listening, in seeing through the mirror without needing to shatter it. So let it all settle now. Let the thoughts fade into background static. Let the story slow. Let the version of you that always had to know finally rest. There is nothing to solve right now, only this breath, this stillness, this quiet, returning to yourself. End of script. Drift gently and I'll meet you in the next thought.